So conventionally, people divide time into the past, the present, and the future. So they believe that the past is immutably fixed. Everything that happened is just, it happened the way it happened. You can't change it. The present is that thing which gives way to the future. A little piece of the future. It takes in a little piece of the future and sheds a little bit of itself into the past. And that's where you find yourself, and everyone finds themselves. That's what you think, right? And you think everyone finds themselves on this same sort of present, and the entire universe is just in this present right here. And the future doesn't really exist. It's kind of just out there. It's potential that hasn't actually come into existence in any sense. Perhaps it has limited potentiality. You can understand that only certain outcomes are likely to happen relative to others, but you still believe that it doesn't actually exist in the same way that the present exists, and it's certainly not fixed in a way that the past is fixed. But this is completely physically wrong, and the reason for this is special relativity. So what's the deal with special relativity? Well, you have this thing called absolute simultaneity. Absolute simultaneity. And this is the assumption that most people have. Absolute simultaneity is where you believe that if we have someone on the same room and another person with that person, and they look at each other in the eye, then everyone would agree that this is happening simultaneously. You're there, you're looking at each other in the eyes. Obviously, it's simultaneous, and everyone would agree. The entire universe would agree with you. In fact, the entire universe is simultaneous to you. Whatever's happening anywhere else, it's happening in your same present. That's what people assume, absolute simultaneity. And it's just, sadly, for people who want to believe in free will, where libertarian free will, where the future doesn't actually exist, or people who want to believe that the past is deleted, it turns out that absolute simultaneity doesn't work under special relativity. And that's because you have to take into account the reference frames in which the observers are embedded. So you have an observer here and an observer here, and they have their own reference frame. And it is into these reference frames that you have to dump this, this thing which you assume has simultaneity. And it may be the case that in this guy's reference frame, it is simultaneous. It is, once you pass it through this reference frame, then yes, it was simultaneous. But when you pass it through this other reference frame, then it's not simultaneous. And that seems so counterintuitive. But it's physically the case from this observer's reference frame that that same pair of events wasn't simultaneous. He didn't see, the two people looking at each other in the eyes, opening their eyes at that same exact moment. He saw one person open their eyes first and then the other in the future. So does that mean that they were already predetermined? If from his reference frame, what he did was in the future. And from this guy's reference frame, yeah, it was simultaneous. So it feels like they actually made a choice together at the same time. But from his reference frame, no, one of them had only exists in the future. He only opens his eyes in the future, and the other one opens his eyes in the past relative to the other guy's future. So if you have this situation and you can't establish physically a preferred frame of reference, one which is better than the other, because how could you say this guy's reference frame is not real It's because this guy's reference frame is, or this guy's reference frame is real. You can't choose one over the other because they're both physically real. So you get, instead of absolute simultaneity, you get relativity of simultaneity. Relativity of simultaneity. And so this really implies eternalism. It implies it. However, notice that what I'm referring to with observers is really meant to illustrate the physical structure of this. So we're not really actually talking about an entire conscious system, which is well defined and into a point like location, because obviously the conscious system would also be composed of points with relative reference frames. So you could think of not just an observer as an entire sort of brain conglomerate of stuff happening, but in order to sort of show to yourself that this is actually the underlying structure of the physical reality, think of it as a neuron. So this point is a neuron here, and this point is another neuron. So this event over here might be the firing of a synapse, the firing of a synapse and the firing of a synapse. And from the reference frame of this neuron, this is going to happen simultaneously. From the reference frame of this neuron, it's not. And so how do you carve out an experiential subject made up of all of these events happening in reference frames that can only be defined relative? Nothing is actually happening simultaneously in some absolute sense. So how can even an observer be absolute? That's where it gets interesting, because then it implies that all of your experiences, whatever it is that is specifying your experience, already has to exist. It already has to exist with pieces in the future and pieces in the past, and that lends a lot of credence to the experience of the present as memory. What some neuroscientists have begun to realize, that the only way to actually experience anything involves having access to information that occurred in the past. And under eternalism, this makes sense. It makes sense that you could actually experience things that are physically past, present, and future, or beyond, in some sense, beyond even the notion of past, present, and future. It's just, and you're part of an eternal object, and your experiences are the same way. They have to be by relativity of simultaneity, because all the pieces going into constructing your mind, again, are relative in terms of their simultaneity. Okay, so imagine a sword that is slightly larger in length than a halo. Then we take this sword, which is laid out along its longest axis, and we have the halo, which is laid out on a plane horizontally. And we're moving the sword upwards and to the right. At some point, the center of the sword is in the same place as the center of the halo. But it is the case since we are moving the sword upwards and to the right, the forward motion component of this is going to create a Lorentz contraction, and therefore shorten the sword so that it may pass through the halo. And this is how you get a camel through the eye of a needle, Lorentz contraction. Then the sort of paradox that seems to arise from this is the fact that if you consider what is happening here from the rest frame of the sword and not the rest frame of the horizontally laid out halo, then you get a different picture in which actually you have the halo being the one which is moving relative to the sword, in which case you have no length contraction of the sword, and therefore it seems to be the case that it wouldn't pass through the halo. So a camel doesn't pass through the eye of a needle, depending on what rest frame you're looking at, whether that's the one of the horizontally laid out halo or whether it's the one of the sword. So how do we resolve this? We resolve this with relativity of simultaneity. Relativity of simultaneity. If you really understand it, then you realize what this is trying to show. And what it's trying to show is that the length of the sword from the tip of the blade all the way to the bottom of the hilt is defined by simultaneity. So since these two are assumed to be simultaneous, then it is the case that you can actually get a length from it. But since we showed that simultaneity is relative by special relativity, then you're going to get also different lengths based on whatever reference frame you are dumping this into, in the way that I showed you previously, where you had some guy's reference frame, some other dude's reference frame. You pass the same simultaneous set of events into this guy, and you get simultaneous. In this one, you get not simultaneous. So this one's in the future relative to the other one. The same is true with length. This is the tip of the sword, this is the bottom of the hilt. You're going to get different lengths based on whatever rest frame you're looking at. So when you were looking at the one with the rest frame based on the sword, when you're looking at the rest frame based on the sword, what's actually moving is the halo. It's the halo, in which case the halo is actually being contracted. It's becoming smaller, and this is not being contracted. The sword isn't. Whereas when you look at it through the other reference frame, where you have this ring just laid out horizontally, and you're passing the sword through it, so it's the sword that's moving. Here it's the halo, and here it's the sword, like this, then you actually do get the contraction of the sword. And so it is the case that it reduces to the issue of simultaneity because of the way that we define length. We define length based on believing that there is actually such a thing as a sword, such a thing as a tip, and a tip of the blade and a bottom of the hilt being simultaneously existing. And that's why we get different lengths based on different reference frames. So, and the same thing is going to be true for angles. Like you get different angles based on 3 simultaneous events. So once you align not 2 but 3 simultaneous events, you can get an angle. That's what an angle, that's the only way you can actually define an angle, is by postulating 3 simultaneous events in this physical space. And so then you also get different angles, and therefore that also plays into this, that whether it's going this way or whether it's this thing going this way, it's actually just looking at the same thing from different reference frames. So in mathematical terms, the Lorentz transformation is composed of 2 pieces. One is where you actually have the rotational component. The rotational is what I showed you, where the reason it doesn't fit through the halo, the sword, is because you have this rotation going on, really. And so now, over here, they were aligned like this. so it passes. Whereas over here, clearly it's going to bump into it. So that's a sort of intuition that you get from the rotational component of the Lorentz transformation. The thing is, for a full sort of Lorentz transformation, you need two different aspects. You need the rotational component multiplied by a non-rotational. And when you do that, you get a seeming total reality which is non-rotational. It's the proper Lorentz transformation. However, you can still rescue the rotational components that we discovered in our comparison of simultaneity by actually multiplying two non-rotationals. So if you get two non-rotational multiplied together, then you can actually get from that the rotational thought experiment making sense again, where that is what accounts for the difference in whether the camel passes through the eye of the needle or not. Okay, so we eliminated absolute simultaneity. So what we have is, if we have any two events that we consider simultaneous, whether that's the bottom of the hilt of the sword and the tip of the sword, or whether it's someone standing on one end of the train and the other person on the other end of the train and just catching their eye, and we define that as having occurred simultaneously, those two simultaneous events aren't going to cash out the same on all reference frames. So in some, like I said, once you actually pass them through the reference frame, they're going to be different from this reference frame, and they might be even different in this way, in this other reference frame. That's just a fact of special relativity. We don't have absolute simultaneity, we have relative simultaneity. Now, the only thing that that confuses people then is that they think, then how is it that we can have causality? How is it that people agree upon the same past? And that's because you actually can have an agreement as long as you have things occurring in your past light cone. So as long as everything that you are referring to, which led up to you, was in your past light cone, then everyone is going to agree that everything in that past light cone led up to that particular instance of something. All reference frames, no matter what, are going to agree that the content of this light cone in the past led to this, and that this location has a limited light cone of things that it can affect. That's the future light cone. And a light cone, really, it's just, why do we call it a light cone? Well, because light is the fastest thing at which information can propagate through the universe, causality itself. And it's a cone because, if you snap your fingers in a moment and then light emanated in all three dimensions from that location, you would get a sphere. But a sphere, which is growing, right? It's growing as it propagates from a single location, a single point location. The cone is a sort of 2D representation because a cone has circles, right? If you cut a cone, it has circles. But a sphere would be, you get a smaller sphere, then a larger sphere, then a larger sphere, then a larger sphere. So it's kind of like a 2D representation of the cross sections of the cone are 2D representations of what would actually be three-dimensional spheres in a four-dimensional cone. Anyway, the point is that from any given location, there is no physical basis for any set of events that represents the present. You can have things defined by their past light cone and their future light cone, and that's the end of it. Yes, you have a causal past and you have a causal future. Every reference frame agrees on the causal past and the causal future. But that's precisely because you're not defining anything here as occurring simultaneously. So that's why you could get it to be a causal influence upon you, as opposed to something which occurs at the same time as you. And so then, therefore, we just have no basis for what is ever present, or even what is time. Like, besides that being defined by your past light cone and your future light cone, where is time? There is no time. Everything is just where it is. And so, yeah, okay, this is going to imply that experiences which are ultimately created from this same fabric, that they're components. So there is no past, present, or future. There's a causal past and a causal future, but there is no past, present, and future in the other sense of the word, in the sense of there's a single present that is uniquely real, that has a past behind it and a future in front of it. Any given point in the universe has a causal past and a causal future. That's the point, that there is no privileged now. There is no now to be found, and therefore no time to be found. There is no time in an absolute sense that could be found anywhere. That would assume a privileged reference frame. It would assume that one of these given points with its causal past and causal future is its own, is reality, is the center of all reality. And believe it or not, there are philosophers who have flat out just rejected empiricism at all levels and just said, yeah, my reference frame is the real one. There is a single one which is real, and it is mine. And that's like that's solipsism. That's the definition of solipsism. So those are your two alternatives. You have to deny, you could deny relativity, in which case you'd just be like an idiot. I mean, you'd just be like a creationist, not understanding natural selection and gene flow and gene drift and so on, and therefore not understanding evolution. You can not understand relativity and deny relativity, even though your GPS system requires relativity to actually work, and you require relativity to work, your mind and everything else. So that's one option. You either deny relativity, or you deny empiricism. Deny empiricism. In which case, you say, what I see and what the evidence tells me is not going to cause me to update on the fact that I take as immutable, that I exist in the present, and that my present is the real present. That's what it reduces to. Those are your two options. Otherwise, you get eternalism, period. This is implied by relativity. And therefore, you can rest assured that death, in the capital D sense of the word, doesn't exist. It doesn't even make sense, because there is no time. There is no time. The future is there, the past is there, and this seeming present is here, and it's always here, because the future is already writ, and the past is experiencing itself. And so all locations from where you can find yourself are necessarily always there. They're diamonds. Diamonds are forever. All mind configurations are also forever.